Day 4 of our trip. We've been hiking for about 2.5 hours now, and we're almost to camp. See, right out there where that tarn is our camp. Massive mountains, all directions. We just came through here, and they were camped down in that basin last night. So I'm hoping we'll get a few more clouds rolling in, and I can get some shots of all these glaciated mountain peaks. Pretty wild area. You can also see the Pacific Ocean out there. This is the river we bushwhacked up for about 20 miles to get up in here. Pretty hard hike to get here. In today's video, I'll be shooting sunset and night sky from this location. I'm going to give you guys some editing tips on how I put this shot together from start to finish. And I'm also going to give you guys some tips on where to focus for sunrise and sunset shots. If you guys want to get full access to all my photography courses, I have a 10-day free trial. You can get access to my photo editing courses, my camera technique courses, and all other skill sets that I use to create photos. You can find the link for that down in the description. Let's get into the video. My tent, Maddie, my friend's tent, and Iron's tent. All around, just mountain peaks. Absolutely crazy. There were some really good clouds rolling through earlier, but once the sun started sinking, they completely dissipated. You can see the Pacific Ocean out there, completely covered in clouds, but I'm gonna zoom down on this scene, I think. I don't think there's gonna be anything else with good light on it. I could try to shoot that peak with alpenglow. Maybe that would work. I was also working on some shots with that tarn. You can see that little tiny lake with the moon reflecting it and some of that green moss and green grass kind of drawing the eyes into it. But I don't know, not the ideal light for shooting tonight, but we have 2 nights in this spot, so should be able to knock it out one of the nights. So I got my camera all set up and I have it zoomed in, cropping right down on all those layers. The sun just peaked behind that mountain right there, so it's getting some side light, and you can see some light rays down there too. So I'm gonna try to isolate in and concentrate on that. You can see composition right there. So for this one, I'm shooting at 135 millimeters, but I'm pretty far zoomed in on this scene, meaning the closest thing to me is way out there. I don't even know how far that is. It might be a half a mile, quarter mile straight line distance. Really hard to judge. So whenever you have situations like this and you're really zoomed in, you could try focusing at the horizontal third line. Let's say we cut this image into horizontal third there and horizontal third there. You could try focusing at the bottom center of that horizontal third line. That would probably work well, like right on that tree line. But what I usually like to do when I'm this far zoomed in is I'll actually move a little bit further away from the horizontal third line. So let's say we cut the image in half instead. So if the half's right there, generally I focus with the focus box just under that half. So that would be this ridge line right there. So I'm just gonna zoom in on that. Back button autofocus, dial it in. Just wiggling the focal ring back and forth a little bit, just to make sure it's perfect. All right, cool. So that's set. Now, the reason I don't focus at the third line when I'm that far cropped in and all the objects are so far away from me is because I found that focusing a little bit further down on that bottom horizontal third just doesn't keep the image in focus all the way to the background, because the image is so far zoomed in and the depth of field is so large. So it's somewhere between that horizontal third and just under the halfway point in the image. So horizontal third right there, halfway point, I kind of straddle those with my focus box. Now, this is going to differ for every different composition and every different scene. So if you're wondering what you should do and you weren't sure, you could take the image first at that horizontal third on the very bottom. And then you could check the focus point, the closest thing in the scene, and the furthest thing in the scene. And if those are all sharp, then you're good to go. But if you notice that the closest point was dropping off at sharp focus, which rarely happens if you're focused that far down on the image, generally the distant or infinity will drop off in focus. And if you notice that, just move that focus box to the point right under that halfway line. Now you can really see the line where the ocean is, and there's just clouds sitting out all over the ocean. So everything under there is probably clouded in right now. We're up above it. All right, that's dialed in. Now I have a really large depth of field here, so I'm just gonna go to f16 and then I'll pull up the histogram. Looks good. I'm gonna push it all the way over to the right, and then I'm gonna dial my circular polarizer until the light looks the best, or the most contrasted, or the most colorful in the back of the screen. Put on a 2-second timer here and fire it off. So it can be really hard to just get used to where you're supposed to be focusing in the scene. But what I would always recommend, start with the horizontal third and then move to that halfway point, because once you get used to it for your specific camera and lens setup, you'll be able to remember for specific crops of specific scenes, if you're really far zoomed in, where you focused at and where it'll work. But at first, until you shoot a lot, you're really not going to remember that stuff. So that's one of the reasons why it's really nice to only have 2 lenses in your kit, because then you can learn them very well and where to focus. So I only have 2 lenses, the 14-30 f/4, and I love this lens. It's killer, especially compared to the old 14-24 that I had on my D810. It's way sharper and there's way less image distortion. So I love this lens. So I just put a circular polarizer on that. And then I have this other lens, which is the 24-200mm f4-6.3. And then I just have a circular polarizer on that. And that covers me from super wide all the way to 200mm. And then if I ended up wanting a crop or an image that, say I wanted a 300mm lens for, I'll just visualize that in the field. Let's say I wanted to zoom way in here to 300mm. I would max it out at 200, and then I would just crop in at home where I wanted that 300mm crop to be. So shooting with a Z7, you have a really large megapixel count, and then you can crop into 300. You don't need to carry a 300, which makes your pack way lighter, and it usually means a lot better quality lens. I find the old lens that I used to have, the 28-300mm, just wasn't that high of a quality, and this 24-200 is super sharp. So that's my setup. Works really well, good for backpacking. So let's first check the focal point, make sure that's sharp. So I focus on that ridge line right there. I'll find the closest thing in the composition, which is this bottom corner right in there. Check, make sure that's sharp. Yep, that looks good. And then I'll just zoom to the very furthest away, which is this back ridge line. And that's super sharp as well. So that focus point was perfect for this scene. And if you're in a hurry, if the light's changing quickly and you're not sure what to do, just do the 1/3 and f16, because that's going to nail it 90% of the time. But there will be edge cases when you're really far zoomed in or the depth of field is really large, where it's just not going to be sharp at that 1/3, so just move it back. But for this specific lens and camera setup, it's hard to miss the focus. So after the sun had set for about 30 minutes, I set up for this shot, and I wanted to capture it where there was still some of that twilight light hitting all the foreground of this scene. So I captured this scene in 3 different shots. First, I captured this part of the scene down in the foreground. Next, I just zoomed in on the moon as far as possible at 200mm and captured it so it would be really sharp in the sky. And I'll show you the actual camera technique for that here in a moment. And then I waited for another 1.5 hours until the stars came out, and I captured the shot of just the sky. Now I could use this shot and overlay it on the underlying foreground shot. And why this is really nice is because if we look at this foreground shot, I shot this at about 800 ISO. So there's a little bit of noise, but there's also really good lighting and contrast in it. If I would have waited to take this shot, you can see my buddy Iron and Maddie down here. There's my tent. If I would have waited to take this shot until the stars were out at this brightness, I wouldn't have had all this nice lighting on the scene, which really breaks it up and adds depth to it, because you have all these transitions from dark to light to dark, and you have the really nice color as well because it's getting hit with that really late twilight light. So these are a few things you can do to really get your shot quality up. So let's jump into the camera technique for capturing the moon, and then I'll show you a few tips for how I actually edited and put together the shot and the final composition. And I'm going to take that moon, and with this shot I'm going to zoom really far in on it, and I'm going to put it above that peak back there. It's going to go over that way anyway, but it's a lot nicer to shoot it while the light's still pretty good in the landscape because the sun just dipped down. So for this one, I use a center of attention or center of focus shooting technique. So if you're shooting just a single thing, it could just be a tent by itself with nothing else in the background that you need to focus on. It could be a person by itself. It could be the moon. All I'm going to do is put the single point spot focus directly over the center of that thing that I really want to stand out. So it doesn't matter what it is, tent, person, moon, flower, whatever else. If it doesn't have a background or a foreground that matters that much, if you choose still a pretty large f-stop, say f11 or f16, what's going to happen is that depth of field is going to extend pretty far in front of that center of attention object and pretty far behind it. So both ways into it. So let's say I focus right on the moon there. That depth of field is still going to come way forward and way back, even if I shoot at f8. So for this moon shot, I'm going to shoot at f8. And I'm going to jack my ISO up to 400. That's about the max usable before it starts to really degrade image quality. And then I'm just going to darken this down. I can watch my histogram. So you can see how dark it is. And the reason for that is because I want to have the shutter speed fast enough that the moon is sharp, because the Earth's spinning and the moon is moving relative to that. So then I can just zoom in right here. Back button autofocus. And if you're going to do this, it's really important that you really dial in the focal ring, especially for a shot like the moon. So I'm just dialing that focal ring back and forth and really keep my eye on that 100% zoom moon until it looks good. All right, cool. So that's perfect. I'm going to put 2-second timer on this, and I'm going to let this one go. So for the moon, it's an easy one because you don't have a foreground or a background. But if you're shooting something like a tent, you could still focus right on the tent. If it's a really large depth of field though, let's say you're shooting this tent and you have the mountains and some of these foliage in the foreground still, you're probably still going to want to use that 1/3 to 1/2, between 1/3 and 1/2 focusing method that I covered in the previous 2 modules. But in this case that you have something that's just the thing you want to be in focus, say a person, and you don't care if anything else is in focus, you could have a person in front of a mountain. The mountain could be slightly blurry and it's still going to look like a really nice shot. So in that case, you would want to focus directly on the thing. Let's take a look at this shot. 1/60 of the second. The moon is super sharp in that. I'm going to go down in ISO to 200 to see if I can improve the image quality for this shot at all. But it's really going to depend on your camera and lens setup as well. The better glass you have, the nicer camera you have, the sharper your image is going to be. So you have some wiggle room. If you make a slight error, the lens is so sharp shooting at larger depths of field, f8, f11, f16, that even if you're a little bit off, it's going to grab that for you because it's just going to extend the sharpness of that depth of field way better than a really cheap lens or a kit lens that might come with your camera. So you can kind of buy your way into sharp focus, but you still really have to know what's going on. That is even better as far as image quality. Man, see all the craters on that thing. Wow. I'll blow this up on the computer so you guys can see it, but I'm going to take that and I'm going to now copy it above that peak right there, and I'll do a quick edit to show you guys how I do that. So this is not quite the final image edit. I still have some final adjustments to do. I need to let it sit for a little bit, but let's break down what I did in this image and I'll show you guys how I put this one together so you can use some of these tips on your own. Now this won't be the full edit because this takes me about an hour to edit through the full thing, but if you want to see my full editing process and learn all these techniques that I use from start to finish, you guys can check out that free link to the 10-day free trial down below this video. It'll give you access to all my camera technique and all my photo editing courses. These are really in-depth courses, and you'll also get free PDFs of all my camera technique, which you can go out shooting with you. All right, so the first thing I have here is just the raw file adjustments. So you can see what it looked like out in the field. I always just do the raw file first. This was the actual raw file look like. You can see there's still some nice lighting from that twilight light. The sun's way below the horizon, but you still get that alpenglow on all the foreground. So I just brightened up that foreground a little bit to start with. And the next thing that I had to do was I had to get the moon into this scene. So it was right out of the scene. Now, if you would have shot this with the moon in the scene, the hard part about it is the moon's so bright and the scene's so dark that it's really hard to get them to merge together to look nicely. And I would also be shooting the moon really wide, so it really warps it because it's up here in the top corner. Anything near the center of your wide angle lens is going to be pretty close to what it actually looked like. But as soon as you get out around the corners, it starts to stretch it out a little bit and it looks unnatural. So taking another moon shot zoomed in at 200 millimeters like I just did is a lot better option. So if I turn this on, let's just go through all the adjustments that I did here. And I'm not going to go through each of these individually because it just takes a long time to do the editing. Like I said, you can check out that free link below if you want all my photo editing courses. So the first thing I did is I waited for this scene to get really dark. And I wanted to get some stars in the sky, more like twilight stars. You can see one starting to show up here, but if I wait another hour, then I get some really nice stars in the sky. So all I do here is I just make a mask that's really sharp right along this edge. I just use this quick selection tool to do that. And then you can mask your stars in. So when I'm capturing this star image, I don't have to keep it in the same composition as right here. I point it way up higher in the sky. So I will just have one image that's all stars. So all I did is tilt my camera straight up from this location to capture that star shot. And the next thing I did is I brought the moon in. So it can be really hard to bring the moon in. So I do a few different adjustments here. The first thing I do is I just pull up that moon image, which we saw before, and I'll take this off. And I just do another quick selection right around the moon. But you can see how unnatural it looks because it's just really, the lighting's not correct compared to this scene. So if you think about moonlight, the sun's way over here. You can see where it's hitting. It's hitting this moon, and then it's reflecting off the moon into the scene. So to make this look natural, I need to do a few different things. Number one, I need to lighten the whole scene up so it makes the sky relative to the ground about the same brightness. And it also reduces the contrast between the moon and the sky. So they look much more natural because they're the same brightness. So this can take a while to get good at and to work on, but eventually you'll get an eye for it. So that's what this levels adjustment down here is about. So you can see my mask here for the moon. If I just click over here and hold Alt, I just moved the moon right over there, and then I just held down and mask it in. You can see what the mask looks like. So that's for the moon. The next thing that's really important after you have the moon on there is doing some light painting. So you can see what I did there is I light painted over the moon. So if we open up this folder, all I do to light paint is I make a single layer that's just blank. You can do one right down here. And then I take the color white, so right here, and I grab a brush, and I just have presets for these brushes that I made. I call it light painting. So flow 15, opacity 20. You want it to be a very low flow and opacity. And then you're just going to take the color white, and you're going to paint it around the moon. You can see that very small difference it made there. And then all I do is I duplicate these up. So this was the first light paint. It had a little bit of glow around the moon, and I'm keeping it on the side that's reflecting off the sun. So the sun's coming in here way below the horizon, hitting the moon and reflecting out. So I don't want much of the light painting on the back side of the moon. I'm keeping it on the front side. So once I have that, I put the blend mode on soft light, and that just keeps the detail of the moon in place while light painting. If you were just to put it on normal instead, it starts to take all the detail of the moon out because you're just painting the color white on it. So I put it on soft light to retain the detail. And then I just start to duplicate these layers up. So all I do is hit Command J, and it just makes a duplicate of this layer. All that does is it slowly brightens this adjustment up. And then the last two, you can see right here, they get big. So I first work that small amount of glow around the moon up, and then I just make my brush way bigger. And with the same white brush, I just do a big blob here, and then I do another one that's even bigger, like that. So I'll take those away so you can see what it looks like. One there. And then I do one that encapsulates this whole area. So it looks like the moon's pushing out light. And that's actually what it's going to look like if you're out shooting. The moon will put out a whole bunch of light. The other thing that's key to keep out, or keep an eye out for here, is that if you're shooting night sky and there's the Milky Way or stars, they're never going to be that bright or contrasted when there's a big moon in the sky. So you have to watch out for keeping your Milky Way too bright if you're going to do this. So you have to really spend some time looking at nature and looking at the sky and seeing what it looks like. So you can see what the light painting adjustment does here. It just filters that moonlight into the scene so it looks more natural. And if I were to go back out and shoot this and look up at the moon, it would look very similar to this. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're bringing these moon into the image, I shot it zoomed in at 200 millimeters, so it's very big on the back of my screen. Then I just used free transform, which just allows you to make the size of the layer different. And I made it the normal size in the sky. If it's too big, it just looks really weird and unnatural. So the next thing I needed to do was adjust the contrast across the scene. So all I did here is I balanced some of the contrast. I noticed there wasn't much contrast down here, so I added some. And this is just a standard levels adjustment. You can see I brought the white point down and the midtones down. So it just added more contrast like that. This next adjustment, I added some color back into the scene. So I noticed that this scene was way too blue. Anything in shadow is generally going to be blue, but as soon as you have a light source, such as the moon or late twilight alpenglow, it's going to add yellow. Light is warm. So I added some warmth back in. And all I did here is I go to highlights under color balance, and I just brought highlights yellow in. So all it did is add yellow, and then I just painted this in where I wanted it, everywhere but the sky, because the sky I wanted to stay blue. And the reason I'm working with these colors here is because of color harmony. So you notice yellow and blue are across from each other on the color wheel. These are complementary colors. They look really nice together. And then to make a triadic color harmony, I accentuated some of the green down there in the foreground. And if you guys want to learn about color harmony, you can Google Dave Morrow color theory, and there's a free PDF in there that talks all about it. You can download that, or you can just go to the link below this video and it has all my PDFs. So the next thing I did was I just worked on some of the color in the sky. I made it a little bit more blue to fall in line with my color harmony. And then I just darkened down the top edge a little bit. You can see this layer mask is just right there. All I did is I grabbed the midtones and I pulled them this way to make them a little bit darker. And what this helps to do is bring the eyes down into the scene. Generally, where eyes are going to move is to the bright places first. So if you don't want the eyes to move out the top of the scene too quickly, then darken down the top of the scene. The next thing is I added a few star glow effects in. So anywhere I have big stars, I do the same thing again. I grab my white brush and the light painting tool, and I'll just click a few times with that light painting tool. We zoom in here, I'll show you how I do one. Right over the star. And it'll slowly brighten them up. Now you can bring this opacity up higher if you want to do it quicker. See how that just adds some glow around the stars? So I'll just pick a few that are already there, and I'll add some glow, and that adds more detail to the top of the scene. And then I put those on lighten mode. Lighten mode will just brighten up the brightest pixels brighter than 50% gray. So it leaves the contrast in the sky. And then, of course, you can dial up your opacity up and down to get those exactly where you want them. And the nice thing about all these layers is I can always change this opacity later when I come back to do the final adjustments on the image. So that's how I did all the basics for getting this to look fairly natural in the final scene. Now, until I let it sit for a week and come back and look at it, I'm never really sure. So take some time away from the photo while you're editing it. The next thing I did is global contrast. So if we look at these layers, first thing I did is I added some yellow to the highlights. I just used a white's luminosity mask, and I just painted in some yellow using color balance in the midtones. So I went to the midtones, added some yellow, and then I didn't do anything in the highlights, just the midtones. So the next thing I did was this layer right here. And let's see if I can remember what I did to this one. Oh, this was just doing some dodging and burning down here in the foreground. So I just used this dodge tool right here, and I lightened up some of the foreground, and then I wanted to keep it out of the sky. So I just put a gradient filter just to make sure it didn't have any sharp edges. Next, I'm using the saturation tool, which you can use to affect hue as well. And I just did some adjustments with yellow and green to move the saturation and hues around, so it just adjusted the color slightly. I felt that it was slightly too warm up here, but I wanted to separate the cools and the warms, so I used hue to do that. Next thing I did was I saw this blob right here was a little bit bright, so I just darkened it down. That just grabbed my eye a little bit. I didn't like it. And then I just added some overall glow to the bottom, just using a levels adjustment. That was this right here. And then I noticed that up in the sky, it was a little too warm around the ridgeline, so I just added a little blue into it using the color balance. So the final cleanup, I did a few different adjustments here. Number one, if we open this up, take these off. I cleaned up some areas, such as right down here, that thing was grabbing my eye. If we look at this, I just look through with my clone stamp tool and I remove anything that's grabbing my eye in the scene, or that doesn't really add to the overall composition. Next, I used texture in the scene. So if we look back here, notice what this adjustment does. Just adds a bunch of texture. All you do to do that is make a brand new blank layer by hitting Shift, Alt, Command, and E. So it just makes a brand new layer that's the combination of all layers below it. And then you go up to filter, other, high pass. And I usually put it around a radius of 2 to 3. And then you put that on overlay, and that'll texture and sharpen all the details in the image. That works really well for twilight or night sky where you start to get noise and lose a lot of your texture. Then I did a vignette on the entire image. So I just leave the center brightness where it is, and then I paint a little bit of dark around the outside. And what this does is it brings your attention, as before, it's kind of light around the outside, but if you darken the edges, it brings your attention to the center of the photo. So that's the vignette. Then I did some more touches of light with the dodge tool. If you look down here, you can see that I just added some contrast down here. I did a few more cleanups right in here. You can look at these areas. I just used my clone stamp tool to get that out and a few of these white spots that are just from color noise. Doing little cleanup things like that can be a huge help. And then this final one, that was an idea I was working on. I didn't do anything, so I'll just delete that one from now. So that's the full start to finish. So we can go from raw file like that, and then just slowly build these on top of each other. You can see I didn't use any really complex techniques here. You don't need any special plugins. You don't need all these advanced techniques or adjustments. You just need to learn how to decide where you want to take the image. The most important thing is to understand how light displays across an image and getting the different color theories to work together using a triadic color harmony. Like I said, down below the video, there's a link. It has my PDF for color harmony. And then you just need to know where you want to go with the image and be able to do very fine adjustments with hand-painted masks. Masking is the most important thing to be able to do. And then know how to apply light and color correctly across the image. So I'm going to sharpen this one so you guys can see the full scale, what it'll look like on my portfolio. I'll just do a 3000 pixel wide horizontal. And I just use the TK actions for web sharpening. I don't use them for anything else, but for web sharpening, they're great. So let's take a look at the full final sharpen. So I think this one turned out really well. I'm sure there's a few things that I'll make adjustments on in the end after I let it sit for a week or two, but overall, I really like how it turned out. This was an absolute awesome location to shoot. I want to come back here again. It was a 50-mile round-trip hike, all of it off trail, so it took some real work to get out here, but I'm going to come back out here and spend a week just base camped in this area, and I will be putting out another few videos that I took in other locations from this trip. So hopefully you guys like this video. Like I said, check out that 10-day free trial link down below. It's got all my camera technique and photo editing videos. I think you guys will learn a lot, no strings attached, and make sure to leave a like, and if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel. I'll be putting another one out next week. Leave me a comment below with a question you may have had. I'll be answering them in future Q&A sessions. Also, leaving me a like or hitting the subscribe button to follow my channel is a huge help. I don't ask for anything besides that, but if you would like to sign up and join my landscape photography school, I have a 10-day free trial which gives you unlimited access to all of the courses that I have that teach every single skill set about landscape and outdoor photography. These are skills that I've tuned, honed, and designed over the last 10 years as a full-time wilderness photographer. So if you'd like to get free access, test out all the courses, learn composition, learn camera technique, photo editing, organization, everything else that goes into the complete creation of wilderness and landscape photography images, check out the link below this video. Get signed up. No strings attached, no credit card required. I just want to give you guys access to understand everything that I know about landscape and outdoor photography. So thanks for being here, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.